there's. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Our program is beginning now.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back. I hope you enjoyed your lunch. My name is Yolanda Aguimont, and I am your MC. Before we get started with the plenary, I invite you to take a look up at your screens. We're about to view a trailer for Amazonia a Nova Minamata, one of the documentaries being featured at the Films for Transparency Festival. Thank you.
As pessoas têm que saber o que está acontecendo.
O mal de Minamata no Japão demorou 35 anos para os japoneses reconhecerem que aquele era intoxicação mercurial. Agora você imagina aqui.
O território Munduruku está em cima de uma grande mina de ouro, mas também em cima de uma grande mina de mercúrio. Mercúrio faz mal à saúde.
Toda a região da Amazônia, onde tem garimpo, está contaminada.
A gente está muito preocupado com essa questão de saúde e meio ambiente, principalmente do povo Munduruku.
Em apenas um ano, os garimpeiros conseguiram destruir um rio inteiro.
A gente se preocupa com a gente, mas tem pessoas também que fazem a pesca aqui nesse rio e leva para a cidade para vender.
Quem come peixe aqui?
Então a gente tem um dano ambiental gigantesco e a gente tem uma comunidade indígena que era autônoma e nessa região eles já passam a ser dependentes do garimpo.
Não há nada mais eficiente para a pega do ouro do que o mercúrio.
E cerca de 10 a 11 bilhões de reais são exportados só apenas a título de ouro do Brasil para outros países. Esse ouro está saindo das reservas nacionais e sendo sugado do subsolo da floresta amazônica sem nenhuma contraprestação à sociedade. Nem o Ministério Público Federal consegue dizer qual é o caminho integral que o ouro percorre no Brasil.
Eu certamente não vão te cantar a cabeça e tocar fogo no teu avião.
Eu precisaria entrar no território Munduruku e saber que eu estou seguro.
São enquanto os povos indígenas estão sendo atacados, enquanto isso, as nossas águas estão sendo contaminadas pelo mercúrio, a nossa água está suja.
Uma vez intoxicado com mercúrio, não existe reversão dos sintomas.
Ela não é uma questão só do Alto Tapajós. O garimpo ilegal está fazendo lá na terra indígena, está afetando pessoas aqui.
Por isso que a gente não pode parar. Por isso que nós estamos aqui ainda resistindo mais de 520 anos e a gente tem que continuar.
A gente vai morrer lutando pela vida e pelo futuro do nosso povo. Nossos filhos, vocês estão matando!
A intoxicação mercurial ela é a ponta do iceberg só.
Quantas toneladas e toneladas que não já foi jogado mercúrio no rio? Se nós não cuidarmos da Amazônia, quem é que vai cuidar?
Wow, so you can catch the full screening of that tomorrow at 6 p.m. in the Palladium Room as part of the Films for Transparency Festival. Now straight into Plenary 3, building the path towards a fair and sustainable future. I'd now like to invite to the podium Anna-Therese Day, independent reporter, filmmaker, and fellow J4T alumna to the podium. Let's give her a warm welcome, please.
Thank you, Yolande, and hello to our audience in person and online around the world. My name is Anna-Therese Day, and I am delighted and honored to moderate our third plenary with such esteemed panelists. I'd also like to warmly welcome all of you international participants to the United States. From the bottom of our hearts, thank you all for making the journey, as the IACC is always a critical and energizing reunion in terms of community. because our challenges, but also our values, know no borders. For me, this is also a homecoming because 10 years ago, it was the IACC who took a chance on a rowdy, muckraking crew of scrappy cub reporters from all over the world, Yolanda and I included. Since then, from Brasilia to Malaysia and a million collaborations and good fights in between, Transparency International's growing network of investigative reporters have worked shoulder to shoulder with many of you, from our frontline human rights defenders and anti-corruption fighters to our thought leaders, our world builders, and our tireless public servants across the globe. Yet, despite many tangible victories, the challenges we face as a global community are stark. They're adapting and emerging rapidly, and the human costs and financial burdens remain inequitably shared. Our countries, our causes, and our communities we serve can't wait. So this panel, Building the Path Towards a Fair and Sustainable Future, we have a heck of a lineup of leaders to share their institutional memory and their forecasting on how we can all best meet this moment. With us, we have the inimitable Alajobi Makinwa, longtime leader in the Transparency International community and currently the Chief of Intergovernmental Relations and Africa at the UN Global Compact. We have private sector pioneers like Nicola Aloca, Autostrade per l'Italia Risk Compliance, Business Continuity, and Quality Director, as well as Klaus Munzmeyer, Novartis Chief Ethics, Risk and Compliance Officer, and a leader of private sector collective action. We also have Natural Resource Governance Institute's President and CEO, Sunita Kemo, one of our fiercest advocates for equitable and corrective solutions to our world's most pressing and intersectional challenge, the climate crisis and sustainable energy transition. And last but not least, the man who needs no introduction here and without whom none of us would be here, we have Peter Egan, the founder of Transparency International. Peter is a lifelong visionary world builder and a tireless anti-corruption good fighter. So thank you all for taking the time, and without further ado, I will join you all and have Alajobi kick us off. Okay, so our first panelist is Alajobi Makinwa, and please begin with your opening remarks.
Thank you very much indeed. I would like to thank Transparency International for inviting the UN Global Compact to this conference. We have been partners for a very, very long time. Indeed, we are all here today, since yesterday actually, because corruption continues to be one of the greatest challenges in our world today. And it ranks as one of the biggest threats to reducing poverty and promoting shared prosperity. We need to share the prosperity of the world, but this is not the case. And this is one of the reasons why we're here today. And corruption happens across all ecosystems. The impact on the private sector is considerable. And you and I have to pay for that because it adds to the cost of doing business. And businesses have to add that cost to us. We have to pay for it. It distorts competition and does not provide for a level playing field. And therefore, it's also to businesses. It represents so many risks: legal risks, for example, reputational risks, ethical risks. And as somebody said a few years ago, for companies that get themselves involved in corruption and they have scandals, that nobody wants to work for a crook, So corruption undermines our capital development, which is essential for sustainable business. Corruption in the education system itself also affects the private sector because at the end of the day, the students that are churned out at the end of the day do not have they are not fit for purpose, and it does affect us. Imagine if you have an engineer that's got the certificates through corruption. You can imagine what that person will be. Corruption also deters investors. It makes the economic landscape unattractive to foreign investment. And you can imagine in developing countries where we need the investment, they will not come. And Corruption also can also influence the quality of investment that is received by a country, because it is the less scrupulous business leaders that will go to a country that is rife in corruption. At the end of the day, they will manipulate, they will not be able to, the investors will not be able to fulfill the mandate of their investment by giving us great projects, you know. So, and even circumventing the laws of the land. At the Global Compact, we at the Global Compact do not naively see business as opportunistic partakers in the problem of corruption, but as a significant part of the solution. We see businesses as a part of the problem of corruption. And of course, we are all here, we are all advocates of fighting corruption. And people always say it takes two to tango. So sometimes business are the instigators, and sometimes they're the victims. And so the Global Compact believes that it's important for businesses that are part of the problems also to be part of the solution. We need to design the solutions together. And so through our work with our partners, Transparency International, ICC, World Economic Forum Pachi, and our sister organization, UNODC, we have developed tools and resources to equip businesses in stemming the tide against corruption and to guide them when they deploy to other countries and locations so that they are well equipped to work with their stakeholders. We also work with investors, ensuring that investors also make the fight against corruption one of their investment decisions. And our sister organization, Principles for Responsible Management Education, works with business schools to equip future business leaders with the right value set and cutting-edge tools to address corruption. Now, let me go to the issue of the Sustainable Development Goals. They are a call to action by all countries to promote prosperity while protecting the planet. Through the SDGs, we are supposed to work towards a better, more equitable, just, and prosperous world. But with corruption, it cannot happen. It cannot, it will. So the theme for this session is building the path towards a fair and sustainable future. That is what Agenda 2030 represents. It is our roadmap, our guide to a place where no one will be left behind. Target 16.5 of SDG 16 on peace, justice, and strong institutions aims to substantially reduce corruption and bribery in all their forms. Similarly, Global Compact's 10 principle asserted that businesses should work against corruption in all its forms, including extortion and bribery. And thank you very much indeed, Peter. You designed this during the time of Kofi Annan. Thank you very much indeed. So corruption is indeed a major hindrance to sustainable development. It clearly goes against the grain of the no one left behind philosophy, which is the foundation of the entire 2030 agenda. And our work in the UN Global Compact is totally against what we actually are planning for. So since yesterday, numerous speakers have spoken on the need for all stakeholders to do more on addressing corruption challenges. Indeed, while the threat of corruption has not declined in significance, I believe that the world is better equipped today to fight corruption more than ever before. So the UN Global Compact participants, they have made progress in staying the course in the fight against corruption. Let me give you statistics from our survey in terms of the company participant, what they have been doing in the fight against corruption. 91% of companies surveyed, Global Compact participants, have anti-corruption policies and practices in place that are aligned to our 10 principles. This is compared with 89% in 2019. We have moved ahead. 43% of our companies are embracing data-driven decision-making to inform their approach towards conducting corruption risk assessments, compared with 41% in 2019. So the private sector is really ahead. 36% are publicly disclosing their progress and holding themselves accountable to their commitment on anti-corruption, compared with 34% in 2019. 93% of CEOs agree that the private sector must play a role in upholding peace, justice, and strong institutions, that is SDG 16, while 76% agree that their company knows how to support the realization of SDG 16. So what am I saying here is that the private sector has actually gone ahead. They're, in my own opinion, much more ahead than government actually in the fight against corruption. But we still need a critical mass. Not everybody, not all companies, but some of them, not all. So, and when the Global Compact started a few years ago, it was, and we had the 10th principle also, it was because there was loss of trust and confidence in the private sector. That, that account one of the reasons. But today, if you look at the Edelman Trust, shows that people that were across the world, the Edelman Trust Barometer Survey conducted for respondents in 27 countries in 2022 identifies that 81% of respondents expect the CEOs to actually play more part in terms of addressing social issues. So they want the private sector to be seated at the table with government. And I believe that even government today realize that they alone cannot fight the fight against corruption. So let me also say here that I acknowledge that governments are doing their best. They've done a lot, many of them, but there's still a lot to be done. That being said, the private sector, in my own opinion, have done much more. And therefore, in the Global Compact, we're working also with private sector, with companies, with governments, and with civil society in our collective action project. We have a number of local networks across the world. We supported, a project on Siemens initiative that we're supporting in terms of fighting corruption through collective action. We've seen that this is one of the best ways of fighting corruption. Let me end quickly because I'm looking at the time. Because I'm also supposed to, my opening statement, to talk about the SDGs. I've said it already that corruption is an impediment to the realization of the Sustainable Development Goals. And next year is the midpoint. There's going to be a review of the SDGs next year. So the summit in next year. So the Global Compact is playing a role in terms of working with the private sector to see where are we, what have we done, where are we? And I hope that many of you colleagues, will work with us in terms of reviewing, the implementation of the SDGs. It's important for us to work together. SDG 617 talks about partnerships. So it's important, and that's what collective action is all about. No one sector can do it alone. We need to work together to fight corruption. We need to work together to stem the tide against corruption. And let us also know that behind every corrupt activity or every demand, there is a human being behind that is impacted. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Thank you, Olajobi. I am going to move on to Nicola. And if we could get our visuals ready, oh wait, that will be afterwards. If you could continue with your introductory remarks.
Yes, thank you, Anna. I would also like to thank Transparency International and the Council for this opportunity. I will start with the breaking bias exercise. Imagine being the head of a laboratory that works to defeat an incurable and deadly disease. Would you invest your efforts to trying to reduce the impact of the disease or trying to find a vaccine in order to eradicate it? If corruption is the disease, would you structure your anti-corruption programs trying to manage the corruption risks, or would you like to eliminate it? There is a European Parliament study that calculated the impact of corruption on EU GDP. According to the numbers, if we were able to eliminate corruption in Europe, we could put an end to hunger worldwide. We could provide clean water globally. We could assure healthcare standards to the poorest countries, and still we would have additional resources left. So I think that we can all agree that corruption is a cross-cutting global issue that we have to face if we want to assure a sustainable future to next generations. Depriving the next gen of key resources such as education, healthcare, security and safety standards, social wellness, environmental rights devoured by corruption is the highest form of inequality that we can leave to our children. For this reason, we must have the courage to admit that it is possible to eliminate corruption. I repeat it. It is possible to eliminate corruption. And we must have the intellectual honesty to give to this target a proper dignity within the SDG agenda, upgrading the concepts already included in the SDG number 16, but with a different vision towards a new SDG as zero corruption. In order to translate this commitment into action, the Business at OECD Anti-Corruption Committee has drafted the manifesto that summarizes the 10 golden rules in the fight against corruption, boosting our race to zero. The manifesto is based on OECD, Transparency International, and other fora best practices. It is a multi-stakeholder paper that can be adopted by public and private organizations and by corporations and business representatives. As business representative, I would like to give you an overview on how we have applied the manifesto within my company. Autostrade per l'Italia, which is one of the largest European motorway operator belonging to the infrastructure industry. 2 years ago, we started a transformation program to become an integrated operator in sustainable mobility. But I would like to represent my company with one number, 21.5, which are the billions of euros that we are spending in Italy to strengthen our infrastructure, with an induced effect on the economy of 65 billion euros. Now, please read this number through my lens as a senior executive in charge for risk, compliance, anti-corruption, anti-fraud, business continuity, and quality director. These numbers increase tremendously Autostrade per l'Italia corruption risk exposure. And for this reason, we have defined within our strategic plan a specific program, including all the initiatives aiming at upgrading our internal control system. The name of the program is Next to Legality, and it is based on OECD, Transparency International, and other fora best practices. It is based on the manifesto. It is based on 3 main pillars. First, adopt a responsible business conduct. This means that we evaluate our actions not only under an economic and financial point of view, but we consider also the social impact and the environmental impact of these actions in the context where they happen. We have a zero-tolerance policy against misalignment. No shortcuts is our motto. And we have implemented specific solutions based on artificial intelligence in order to increase our compliance capacity, enabling a continuous monitoring system. Now, the reason why we disclose the Next to Legality through the strategic plan is because in this way, we are able to trace the compliance footprint within the industrial plan. This way, we give to compliance indicators the same dignity as the performance KPIs. This way, we clearly state that there is no trade-off between performance and compliance, results and rules, business and values. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Nicola. We're going to skip Peter and go to Sunita, and we'll come back to you at the end.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the opportunity to be here today, and thank you, Peter, for giving us the reason to all come together. When I think about the sheer magnitude of the challenges that we face in pursuit of a fair and sustainable future, honestly, it can feel quite overwhelming. And I think what we need in this moment is a tipping point issue, an issue on which we can all collectively act, and that will be a catalyst for exponential progress towards this future that we all seek. And I believe that that singular issue is addressing corruption in the oil, gas, and mining sectors. Now, we need only look to history or to the headlines for proof that extractive sector corruption is at the root of so much poverty, so much inequality, and so much instability. Take, for example, Operation Car Wash. This was a corruption scandal that unfolded initially in the procurement systems of Petrobras, but it involved billions of dollars of bribes, was implicating businessmen and politicians alike across Latin America, and led to tremendous economic devastation and political instability. Or take the recent investigations into Glencore and its subsidiaries. We have found proof of millions of dollars of bribes given in countries around the world, particularly in Latin America and in Africa. Earlier this week, Glencore settled with the government of the DRC for a mere $180 million. Now, you may think that that's a lot of money, but if you're a Congolese citizen, is that really enough to combat the corruption that impacted your everyday life? And then lastly, of course, we cannot forget Russia's absolutely devastating aggression against Ukraine. And Vladimir Putin has consistently consolidated power on the back of national oil companies. And it is those oil profits that are enabled by international and Western companies that have consolidated his power and enabled this aggression. So, if the case for the importance and the impact of extractive sector corruption is so clear, then why is it urgent to act now? What is the opportunity in this moment? And I'd like to offer 3 different reasons. First of all, because poverty is on the rise, and it is especially devastating to resource-rich countries. Secondly, because corruption in the mining sector and in the fossil fuel sector is what stands between us and a greener planet. And thirdly, because the global fight for democracy is imperiled by kleptocrats whose lifeblood is that extractive sector. Let's first look at poverty. In 2020, we saw the first rise in global poverty since 1998. This year, the World Bank projects that 75 to 95 million people will be pushed back into extreme poverty. And by 2030, half of the world's poor will live in resource-rich developing countries. Now, as was discussed by my colleague, the funding for meeting the Sustainable Development Goals has always been scarce. But it's even more scarce now as these countries have been pushed further into debt by the pandemic. And corruption only worsens that problem. Money that could be available for schools, for roads, for healthcare, for infrastructure is instead going to fund private interests. Let's look at Angola. It's one of the top 15 oil exporting countries in the world. 75% of government revenue comes from the oil sector. And yet, 50% of the population lives on less than $2 a day. We have the power to alleviate poverty, but we have to address the corruption. Secondly, on the climate front, corruption risks absolutely derailing the path to a sustainable future. On the mining side, the International Energy Agency projects that in order to meet the Paris goals, we will have to quadruple the demand for transition minerals. Transition minerals are those minerals that are needed for solar panels, for wind turbines, for electric vehicles. Now, this all has to be done, this quadrupling, by 2040. We know that past commodity booms have unleashed corruption risks. And we also know that the mining sector has a pretty poor track record. It's notoriously problematic. It impacts negatively local communities, there's environmental degradation, and all the while, elites just get richer. What we know, as Administrator Power cited in her opening speech on the very first day of the conference, transition minerals and corruption in the transition mineral supply chain can make or break climate action for the entire planet. It is our low-carbon future that is at stake, and it risks deepening the inequities in these resource-rich developing countries. Now, the fossil fuel side is no better. Influence Map cited that 3 years after the Paris Agreement was signed, the 5 largest publicly traded oil and gas majors invested over $1 billion in misleading climate action and climate lobbying. Global Witness more recently reported that in the registration for COP27, there were more fossil fuel lobbyists than there were representatives from the top 10 nations most impacted by the climate crisis. And Energise's own research on national oil companies, which produce over half of the world's oil and gas, showed that those companies are on track to invest another $400 billion into oil and gas projects. That's money that could be used for citizen priorities and citizen interest instead. And those investments are not even going to break even unless we completely blow our emission targets. So here's what we know. We know we need to wind down the fossil fuel sector, but instead what we see is that vested interests and a corrupt elite that is fueled by oil stands in the way of progress. And that leads to the final frontier of a fair and sustainable future, and that's the fight for democracy. Countries with authoritarian regimes produce about 50% of the world's oil. They persist by growing that oil sector and then milking it to consolidate their power. But they don't work alone. They are enabled by European and US energy companies and commodity traders. Here's just one example. In Russia, those companies have contributed over $95 billion to the Russian government via oil and gas projects since the invasion of Crimea in 2014. To bring down kleptocrats, we have to stop the companies that enable them. The threat to democracy is, of course, not limited to the oil sector, and there are rife examples of how minerals have fueled conflict and authoritarianism in countries like the DRC, like Sierra Leone, like Myanmar. The bottom line here is that addressing corruption in the oil, gas, and mining sector can tip the balance on 3 fronts that are absolutely essential to our fair and sustainable future. They can alleviate poverty, they can secure a greener planet, and we can advance democracy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sunita. Klaus, we are going to turn to you now.
Thank you. When I read the topic of today's conference, building the path forward of a fair and sustainable future, I thought maybe I want to structure my words around 4 topics or 4 themes. First of all, the difficult topic of trust, also trust between us here. What can companies do in this situation where we are? The value of international platforms. And lastly, close to you also, an outlook on ESG. The most difficult topic maybe is trust. I mean, I believe when we learned hard one thing in the pandemic was, again, and this is similar to the fight against corruption, these topics can't be addressed only by the public sector alone, or by the NGOs, or by the private sector. No pandemic, and speaking as a member of the leadership team of a pharmaceutical company, we have seen this, we have learned this, it's all interconnected. The only way is to fight together against the pandemic, and corruption is a pandemic as well, as we know. Trust building is difficult because, let's put the elephant here in the room, in all big organizations, being it private or public, there will be issues. And believe me, I'm now 20 years in the battlefield of compliance. There will be always issues because we all are part of society. A company is part of society, as a town is, as an NGO is, as the rest of civil society. So there will be issues. So trust building is also to talk about this, acknowledge this, see that companies who talk about misconduct, failures, accidents are not the bad companies. I mean, the bad companies are the ones who say everything is perfect, wonderful, paradise, we have fantastic culture, nothing will happen. We need honesty and also the respect for the ones who are honest and put the things on the table. So what can we do in companies? We of course need to maintain the focus of anti-corruption very clearly, but we need to think the fight against corruption bigger in companies. What's the reason why at Novartis is that we need to bring the ethical dilemmas. I can tell you in the pharmaceutical industry, and I'm sure you agree, we have ethical dilemmas from early research over development to manufacturing to the way how we commercialize our medicines. Ethical dilemmas need to be linked to a proper risk management, because look where we are, the situation where we are, a pandemic, supply chain, the war of Russia and the Ukraine. These are all risk topics which potentially have a corruption risk as well. So ethics, risk management, and compliance should go hand in hand. And this may be also a thought for the public sector to bring these topics closer together. Because if we stay in the anti-corruption corner only in our organization, we will have no impact. And ask yourself, if you are in government, if you are in a private company or wherever, where are you? Which impact do you have? We made a decision at Novartis to put the role on the executive committee because we say this has to be impactful in the company, just to make it visible that this is an important topic for the organization. About international platforms, and I just brought the B20 policy paper from the G20 B20 summit in Indonesia with me. We had an integrity and compliance task force also in Indonesia, and it is so important that we keep the topic on the international platforms, and therefore I'm so grateful to be here also on this platform. Because it's not a given. Whenever there are new topics, understandably, international organizations and governments will reprioritize climate, the pandemic, the war. But we need to keep the topic of integrity, compliance, ethics, anti-corruption on the agenda of these platforms. And I sincerely hope that India, who takes over the B20 and G20, keeps this as we had it in the last couple of years, also in the B20 and the G20, at the OSD, at the UN, at the WEF, and elsewhere. So what are basic learnings? This topic of thinking compliance broader is absolutely also in the policy paper. Sustainable governance, to make the people more aware of this. In the private sector, make the boards of directors more knowledgeable, educated, asking the right questions about risk topics, compliance topics, and ethical topics in companies. These are all issues you will find in the document. I really recommend the reading. I know it's going fast, it's another year, but it's really important that we also not forget what we have done there. And then maybe lastly about ESG. You talked very, very impressively how this is all connected. We need to be all behind this. My only wish is, let's make ESG not a bureaucratic monster. What we learned from the fight against corruption in companies, the more policies and controls and paper you put into the system, the people will circumvent, will get tired, compliance fatigue. You need to see the impact, you need to address the culture, you need behavioral science to get people on board. And the same is true for ESG. ESG at the end is about impact, what you said. I mean, if impact is relevant, not a checklist and only reporting. And I think we should also discuss that when we look at future ESG regulation, we need this, we need reporting standards or clear disclosures. But we always have to ask the question, where is the real impact? Or is this only another accounting standard which we somehow digest in the organizations, will be audited, but we don't see any impact? So trust between all of us, which is difficult, and there are disappointments, let's face it, but let's be open to speak, at least listen to each other if something goes wrong, because always topics will go wrong. Sustainable governance in companies, thinking compliance broader than only anti-corruption, but having a focus on anti-corruption, using and maintaining the topic on international platforms, and never forgetting that ESG is about impact and not only about reporting standards. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Klaus. Now for our final address, I would like to open it up to Peter Egan.
Well, thank you very much for allowing me to address this meeting. I'm very excited about it because you may not know it, but this is a huge birthday party. This is the 25th birthday of this international corruption conference being managed by TI. The first meeting we had under our Transparency International guidance was in Peru in 1997. And in fact, it was opened by President Fujimori, one of the most corrupt presidents of the world. And fortunately, he was put to jail. And so was his companion, Mr. Montesinos. So this is a good sign. We may know a couple of heads of governments who are willing to go to jail for what they are doing nowadays. And at this first party, when I was chairing a meeting like this here, I saw 3 representatives of Nigeria sitting in the first row. It's beautiful boo-boos, very impressive people. They were the representatives of President Abacha. President Abacha of Nigeria had just put my predecessor, the chairman of the Advisory Council of Transparency International, in jail. So I asked the audience whether they would be willing to stand up for a minute of silence to show their solidarity with President Obasanjo. And that gave me the idea that maybe we have a similar issue which binds us all together. Yes, we are here to fight corruption, but as we heard from Sunita, corruption really enabled one of the worst and inhumane activities which is going on as we are sitting together, where women and children and innocent citizens are being killed and maimed nowadays or driven from their homes in the Ukraine. And I wonder whether it is presumptuous for me to ask you all to stand up for 1 minute in silence in solidarity with the victims of this war in the Ukraine, and with the hope that this war ends very soon. Thank you very much. thank you very much for this wonderful symbolic gesture. But now let's turn back to our business, fighting corruption. I find very exciting how Transparency International has managed to score its greatest achievements whenever we organized cooperation, independent cooperation with the other sections of society, with the business, with government, and of course also with civil society. So this is this multi-sectoral, multi-stakeholder approach which has helped us from the very beginning as Transparency International to succeed. Even before we were founded, I talked to, at the time, Robert McNamara, who had been the president of the World Bank also and was extremely popular. I told him that we were thinking of creating a joint action which would oblige various competitors in concrete competitive situations to commit themselves to stop bribing, all at the same time. This was a possibility for us to overcome the problem that those who behave more moral, more ethical than the others, they suffer for it. That prisoner's dilemma, as it was called, was very hard for people like business people from Germany or from the UK or from Japan to think of stopping bribery in the international marketplace because they thought they would be punished for it because losing all their contracts. McNamara was so excited about it that he said, I'm coming to your launch conference of Transparency International to Berlin. And while we were walking through the Brandenburg Gate with him, and he was very touched because he had managed at the Cuban crisis to protect Berlin against basically destruction. He said, if you manage to get an integrity pact like this going in a couple of interesting countries and interesting companies and interesting civil society organizations, I give you $10,000 out of my pocket. In fact, he traveled with me through Africa to see 6 presidents in Africa to convince them to introduce this into their next competitive bidding under World Bank projects, because the World Bank was opposed to fighting corruption at the time. And it was this integrity pact and its possibility of avoiding the prisoner's dilemma for people who participate with us, which accompanied us all the time. On that basis, for instance, we managed to convince Siemens, to convince Lufthansa, to convince many other companies which were not under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in the United States and who were allowed to bribe internationally under their own home country laws, to join us and basically meet with us at the Aspen Institute in 1996 for the first time and sign an open letter to the Kohl government, which was resisting any attempts to criminalize international bribery. And in fact, because of this integrity pact, Siemens and a number of other business leaders in Germany supported this as an open letter. And this is why the OECD Convention Against Foreign Bribery was signed in 1997. And this is why so many fantastic things happened, including, for instance, that the World Bank turned from Saulus to Paulus, as we heard so vividly from the speakers of the World Bank at this conference. And Jim Wolfenson, of course, was a great hero in this process. So this is how we managed to interact with the other stakeholders in what we now call the multi-stakeholder approaches. And this is my recommendation, because we are here really to building the path towards a fair and sustainable future. I want to recommend that we at Transparency International and this whole community adopt this multi-stakeholder approach as one of our most powerful tools in changing situations which are very poorly governed. Like the natural resources sector, which Sunita described here so well, and created EITI. I still have some of my old folders sitting on my desk. This is a multi-stakeholder organization where this magical triangle of good governance, government, which is very often democratically legitimate, private sector, which is driven by its tremendous power of innovation and technical capacities and control of the globalized economy, and civil society. So my recommendation in this meeting is, let's make this multi-stakeholder approach one of the major tools of our fight against corruption. I know that the Global Compact, for instance, is very much driven by a multi-stakeholder approach. I know that many of the concepts which we developed, for instance, these sectoral integrity pacts which we included with the banks, which ended up in the Wolfsberg Principle, which we concluded with the electric power companies, which were participated or were driven basically by Mark Peart, my friend from the Basel Institute. And so this has become a proven approach which works. And I'm right now pursuing this in Africa for energy. We have created the Fisheries Transparency Initiative, again, with having government, civil society, and private sector meeting regularly, and not in a sort of ad hoc situation where you go away after a while, but you continue to stay there as an advisory group, not only avoiding the prisoner's dilemma, but also building consensus, because that's exactly what is happening in EITI, for instance, where there is a consensus right now on certain standards which oil and gas and mining companies want to follow, which go far beyond what we were aiming at the beginning when we only asked for publish what you pay. So right now this has become a real driving force of good governance. So that's my recommendation. Let's go for this multi-stakeholder approach in many areas which are particularly vulnerable to bad governance. I'm right now, for instance, pursuing this in African villages in order to promote electrification of rural areas, because in the villages very often the governance is so bad that even with this new technology and clean energy and so on, people don't dare to invest in villages in Africa, and about 300 million people in Africa dying prematurely because they cook with firewood and so on within their huts. So this is something which I would like to recommend and bring as a learning from my experience with Transparency International for 25 years, no, for 30 years, with this International Anti-Corruption Conference for 25 years, and with you since 25 hours.
Thank you very much, Peter, and thank you to all of our panelists. For the next 20 minutes or so, we're going to do some questions with me, and then we'll open it up to the audience. I'd like to begin with you, Nicola. When you were talking with us about the Anti-Corruption Committee's manifesto, could you speak to us a little bit more about some of the details and go through those with us?
Yes, the main source of the manifesto is the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention and the following recommendations, but after Peter's speech, I think that the main source of manifesto is Peter. So thank you. And the business at OECD has contributed to the update of recommendations from the very start, providing the business perspective as institutional stakeholder of the OECD, representing over 7 million companies and 60 million employees. As I said, the manifesto summarizes the 10 golden rules to translate commitment into action. You see the 10 golden rules. The first is racing to zero. In these 2 days, I heard a lot of inspiring speeches, but the word zero was never associated to the word corruption. So the first principle of manifesto is let's break bias that corruption cannot be eliminated. The second is zero tolerance. We have to strive for zero tolerance against any form of corruption within all jurisdictions. Number 3, stimulate responsible conduct. In each speech, in each panel, we underline the importance of integrity, of transparency, of ethics, I will mention just one key element for responsible conduct that is education. Because effective education policies and programs translate into a better equipped, skilled, and future-ready population. The fourth principle is human rights and anti-corruption. Corruption is a crime that can undermine human rights. For this reason, organizations should integrate anti-corruption framework in their human rights programs. Number 5, incentivize and protect brave voices. We have to support and defend the good guys of yesterday's speech of Mr. Sullivan. The good guys that have the courage to speak up and to take actions towards a different direction, ensuring a psychologically safe environment. Number 6, collective actions for a multi-stakeholder approach. Peter, I swear I didn't know your speech before doing it. And this is what Peter said, and on this the Basel Institute is doing a great job. So I wouldn't focus on it after Peter's speech. Number 7, tech for trust and transparency. This was explained yesterday in a very well way by Delia's speech with the stand-up exercise. And I have to say that every time that Delia talks, it's like for me, it's stunt training. So thank you, Delia. And technology is the game changer in the fight against corruption. So I'm sure that till this moment, someone from the audience is thinking, what about the small and medium enterprises? So we have the number 8, is think global and act local. So actions and behaviors have to be inspired by a global vision, respecting the peculiarities of local contexts. This means that when we set up an anti-corruption program, we have to use a building block approach to meet the budget constraints and the limited compliance capacity of small and medium enterprises. Number 9, Anna, thank you for your job. This is a representation of your category, but promote the freedom of press. Press help in the fight against corruption, protecting our society by uncovering the truth and providing transparency. Vigilant media, the freedom of press, is a fundamental human right. Number 10, please join me in this definition, but the benefits from zero corruption have a positive impact on the achievement of the other SDGs. So it's a cross-cutting issue with the proper dignity within the SDG agenda. But I would like to leave you with the essential truth about zero corruption with the 3 main sentences. It's on, it's us, it's a must. It's on because zero corruption is already happening. We pushed the bottom from off to on. It's us, only together we can make it happen. It's a must. Zero corruption exists because we have no plan B. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nicola, for that presentation. And on this note, Klaus and Olajabi, could you both speak to us a little bit about what it looks like when multinational corporations are able to work down the supply chain and incentivize better behavior? Could you both speak to it from your points of view?
Thank you very much indeed. I think my colleague had just mentioned in terms of the manifesto, talking about the small and medium enterprises, the peculiarities, given the fact that they do not have the resources, they do not have the time to fight corruption, and they are faced daily. I come from a developing country. They are faced daily with regulators, also demanding bribes and all that. So, and the Global Compact, most of our participants are actually small and medium enterprises. Yet we expect them to fight corruption. We expect them to take into account environmental issues and all that, even human rights, and yet they don't have the capacity. So we conduct a number of training. Also, we produce reports and tools and resources to guide small and medium enterprises in this anti-corruption journey. And many of the resources they are on our website, for example, fighting corruption in the supply chain. But beyond that, we ask the multinationals actually to help in supporting small and medium enterprises. A few years ago, we had a collective action project in one of our countries, and we asked the banks actually to serve as incentives. What do I mean by that? To work with the small and medium enterprises, encouraging them that if they are not involved in corruption, then they will be paid on time, then they will be suppliers of choice also to multinationals. So we believe that, and there are so many other incentives, to encourage small and medium enterprises to walk the journey. We make sure to tell them that if you continue to engage in corruption, at the end of the day, you cannot last. Because corruption cannot be a business strategy. If it is your business strategy, it cannot last long. And at the end of the day, we're talking about sustainable business. So for your company to be organized, company to be sustainable, you need to invest in the long term. And that cannot be with corruption. So indeed, the multinationals, the big companies also, in any country, they are important in terms of encouraging the small and medium enterprises and not just demanding from them that they have to sign a document to say that they are not involved in corruption, but they have to be handheld and ensure also that the suppliers within your supply chain, the big companies also working together, So if you are the Global Compact participant in a country, we encourage every big companies and the multinationals to work together to ensure that small and medium enterprises in their value chain are trained and they have the information necessary, and we support them. Thank you.
So the multinationals definitely have a convening power and a duty to focus on this on the supply chain. I mean, this is clear. I come to the challenges in a second, bear with me. What I think we should do and what we do, and many companies are doing the same, we have a code of ethics for the associates, which, by the way, we co-created with the associates in the company, because it's much more powerful if the people write a code of ethics and not a code of ethics is imposed on them by management. We have the same, we have a similar code of ethics for our suppliers, so a third-party code. But that's all paper, yeah? That's all paper. So you need, in a multinational organization, a really, really sophisticated third-party risk management. That's a lot of work, and many of you know it's a lot of work. The issue and the challenge is what is often underestimated. It's not so much the tier 1 suppliers. The problem are the tier 2, tier 3, tier 4 suppliers, where we don't have a direct contractual relationship. There are legal boundaries, there are factual boundaries to audit them, to get them into the same platform. And I think this is a joint effort what this community has to think about, beyond just passing on a contractual clause to your next supply chain. You can't bribe, you have to respect human rights. We need more. What could this be? Capacity building. Unfortunately, it's always a scandal which triggers these topics. So years back, there was a big environmental human rights scandal in India, Musi River, where suppliers of pharmaceutical companies polluted the Musi River and destroyed the ecosystem. As a consequence, the industry founded the Pharmaceutical Supply Chain Initiative to create same standards, audit rights, supplier audits, human rights standards for suppliers. Not perfect, it's all on a journey, definitely not perfect, but This is capacity building to try across the whole supply chain, outside, beyond your own company boundaries, to do something. This, again, coming back to my initial thoughts, this requires trust between the public sector, the private sector, the NGOs, because this capacity building only can be done together in the global supply chain.
Peter, go ahead.
Thank you very much. I wanted to first respond to Nicolas' demand that we should go for the zero corruption. But then I heard what Klaus had to say, and I'm even more driven to respond to him. So if I may, I do both. Nicola, I think we all are in favor of zero corruption, but we want to simply spare ourselves sort of an unrealistic, wishful goal. I mean, Transparency International is, of course, aiming for zero corruption. And then, as a compliance officer, people should aim for zero corruption in their company. But we know that the fight against corruption is an incremental matter. I think incremental is a very, very important term which we should keep in mind. The Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, for instance, in the extractive industry sector, aimed simply for publishing what they pay. Publish what you pay to your host governments. So they didn't ask for human rights protection, they didn't ask for labor laws, they didn't ask for environmental protection, any of the things. We just asked for publish what you pay. So a lot of people said in the beginning when we started that this is so modest that it doesn't help anybody. But we knew that once we create this trust, which you have mentioned earlier, Klaus, through this interaction, we can begin to expand. We incrementally expand what we consider to be good governance. And this is exactly what had happened at the EITI, where they have gone to major elements of fairness, of extractive industry investments in Africa and Latin America and Asia, which goes far beyond the publish what you pay. So it is more or less a strategical, if you want, a tactical approach that you try to diminish corruption, and of course we are aiming for the zero. But let me say one quick word about what you said, Klaus, about the supply chain. I mean, we in Germany, we are very proud that the government has now passed some legislation against activities in the supply chain which are not socially acceptable. And the European Union has followed with Richtlinien in the same direction. I personally feel that this is only a torso, because it imposes on the importers, with the governmental power of Germany, for instance, to stop importing things which are produced somewhere else under violation of basic governance rules like human rights, child labor, and so on, which is a fantastic thing. But it is only a small part of the real approach to it, because the real approach should be to go into these producing countries and try to change their minds on how they produce. And that's what we did with the Garment Industry Transparency Initiative. We started in Bangladesh, multi-stakeholder meetings with the factory owners, with the labor unions, with the workers in the fields, with the suppliers, with everybody who was relevant for the production in Bangladesh. And that combined with a restriction on the import in Europe by big buyers and consumers on violation of corporate social responsibility. That will do the trick. But only the rules for the companies, for the producers on supply chains, I think we cannot achieve much. And we are seeing in Germany right now that many of the textile companies in Germany are leaving the Textilbündnis, which focuses very much on the responsibility of these consumers. What we have started has been more or less abandoned. This is why I'm so keen to re-establish this multi-stakeholder approach, which in the Garment Industry Transparency Initiative seemed to work very well. In Bangladesh, at least, we had 3 or 4 meetings. We had a big conference. We had a conference in Myanmar on this, and all this was ended, basically, when the government took it over and made it into a governmental program. And of course, a governmental program doesn't have the same credibility as a multi-stakeholder program, which is driven by the input, the interest of everybody. Like we say in Germany, it is deliberative democracy we are looking for. We are looking for democracy of people listening to the others, to accept and understand their perspectives, their interests, and then begin to interaction to find a consensus which they can then advise the government, which has the democratic legitimacy to use its power to introduce it. So this is what I call multi-stakeholder approaches, which goes beyond simply the Integrity Pact and its attempt to overcome the prisoner's dilemma.
Thank you. For the sake of time, we're going to open up to audience questions. If you can come to one of the microphones. But while we wait for people to line up, Sunita, I think a lot of our panelists spoke to one of the themes of your work, the art of what's possible. So could you speak to what this combination of the carrot and the stick in terms of enforcement, but also inducement for extractives?
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you so much, Anna. And I think listening also to this conversation on supply chain, what's important to realize is that we are essentially standing at a crossroads right now. And there are two possible scenarios that can unfold. One scenario is that in which countries that are rich in these transition minerals, the producing countries, see the increase in demand lift them out of poverty to finally have the revenues that are necessary to pursue the Sustainable Development Goals, and where we collectively take steps towards meeting the Paris goals. Now, there's a second scenario which could also unfold, and frankly, we're trending that direction. And that's one in which producing countries actually fall prey to continued political instability, to state capture, to loss of public funds, to environmental degradation, and where the planet continues to burn without the resources that are necessary to enable this transition to a low carbon future. And the reason that we're trending that direction is because the countries where these transition minerals are mined are generally in the lower half of TI's corruption perception index, and they are countries where civic space is very significantly constrained. And so that what that means is you don't have the possibility of civil society voice to combat corruption. Just this week, NRGI has published a series of recommendations on how we can galvanize action towards that scenario one. And Peter, it's very much based on the multi-stakeholder approach that you were promoting. This is an expert group that was co-convened in partnership with EITI and also with the OECD, and it drew on expertise from civil society organizations, from governments, from academia, and as well from the private sector. And that expert group highlighted just a couple of recommendations that I wanted to bring to the fore, very much building on the comments of my colleagues. First of all, that we need to prevent corruption from weakening the protection of community rights and the enforcement of environmental and social standards. Secondly, that we need to prevent political elites from unfairly capturing opportunities. Thirdly, that we need to avoid enabling kleptocracy and state capture through mitigating corruption risk, but also discontinuing business relationships where appropriate. And perhaps most importantly of all, we need to support the rights and activities of civil society organizations, of whistleblowers, of journalists, and anti-corruption actors. But Klaus, as you said, it's not just about the standards, it's really about the implementation and the impact. But we believe by implementing these recommendations, we can put the entire world on the path to sustainable development. Thank you.
Let's start over here.
Transparency International Kazakhstan. My name is Aydar Igyubayev. A question to Sunita Kaimal. Fueling corruption technically comes from financing mineral resources. And this financing comes from foreign direct investments. And these foreign direct investments come from developed countries, from oil companies, corporations, that do mineral resources business. Do you think it's necessary or possible to set legislative and corporate requirements in Europe and USA for Western oil companies, including super majors, to publish their current contracts? We know that EITI is doing the work influencing the governments in the oil-rich countries to do that, but do you think it would be maybe also effective, if not more effective, to push from the other side, not only in the governments of oil-rich countries, but also for the governments of the oil companies' countries? Thank you.
Do you want to take a round, or do you want me to? I'll start with you for this one, and then maybe we'll grab some more questions.
Okay, great. Yes, thank you so much. Peter was just whispering in my ear that, no, in fact, contract transparency is something that is mandated, and we're making advancements globally, not just in resource-rich developing countries. And that is what's key. Piecemeal action on things like contract transparency, on things like beneficial ownership, leads only to piecemeal results. So absolutely, it is this drive for mandatory disclosure rules that we are promoting around the world.
Thank you.
Can we do in the center?
It's okay. My name is David Ugolo. I work for an NGO based in Nigeria called African Network for Environment and Economic Justice. Again, thank you, Mr. Peter, for this great work you've done for the world. And now you're sitting down with the people again, advocating for multi-stakeholder approach. But unfortunately, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. We have EIT as we speak. The biggest corruption has not just been reported across Africa, Glencoe. The issue of corruption is about justice, it's about power. Who decide? The bribe taker and the bribe giver. The bribe givers from the north, represented by Glencoe, they decide the story. They tell the story. Where we have the CNN in the north, they report the story. So, as we speak, EITI is generating data in Nigeria. Now you've seen what has happened in NNPC. And those who are involved in the Glencoe corruption, right from the time of Ali Botham, they are still there. So, that culture of impunity sustained by the current anti-corruption framework, architecture, cannot be challenged by multi-stakeholder. Sitting down with thieves, kleptocrats, to decide how things should be done within country cannot change the system. We must discredit them. We must call them the name they are. And until the North stop creating platform for them to survive, we cannot. So the approach is we must call them the right name. The multi-stakeholder approach gives them legitimacy to operate. It sustains them. And so my question to you is that, is there evidence that EITI is solving the problem in Nigeria? Thank you.
Yes, we'll have a response to this one as well about accountability and impunity. Oh, yes.
Well, thank you very much for reasoning it so clearly what you are saying, because you are right in many ways. I mean, first of all, you are right when you say that a lot of corruption is driven by the bribery of multi-stakeholder companies, including, of course, companies from the north, including companies from countries like Germany, which allowed foreign bribery until 1999, until we, Transparency International, helped the OECD to get the OECD Convention on the books through multi-stakeholder approaches. But in the case of Nigeria, I observed that President Obasanjo, when he was a president, he asked his Minister of Mines, Obi Ezekwesili, to chair the multi-stakeholder group in Nigeria. In fact, he enabled EITI to get going because in the beginning, the African home countries or the raw material producing countries like Angola, for instance, they threatened the companies. They said, if you tell this organization what you pay to us, I mean, Lord Brown told me that. He was the head of BP. When he went to Angola and said, we are going to join this Publish What You Pay initiative, they said that we immediately stop your production rights in Angola, because we have confidentiality clauses in our lease agreements, and if you do that, then you are out. Now, this is why we needed the support of civil society and other governments, and this is why this multi-stakeholder approach in EITI did work. Obasanjo, as president of one of the most important raw material countries in the world, he was in Berlin helping to celebrate the 10th anniversary of Transparency International. He announced at that meeting, in a big meeting like this, Transparency Nigeria, the government of Nigeria, not only will allow the publication of what we are being paid by the mining companies, and in fact, I can tell you, we get more than $50 billion every year from the oil and gas companies in Nigeria, which is an immense amount, but nobody knew about it. Not even the parliament knew about it. It was not part of the budget. It was kept secret at the time. So he said, we are going to make it mandatory to report these payments, which they are making to us. And this is why Obasanjo started basically the possibility of EITI to operate. And as long as he was president, and Nuhu Ribadu was the head of the anti-corruption agency in Abuja, and Obi Ezekwesili was the minister of mines, it worked. And they were able to come to grips with this tremendous corruption in Nigeria. And of course, since this time, Obasanjo has lost his influence. He is now back in his presidential library in Abeokuta, and sadly doesn't have the same leverage anymore. So it doesn't work if one or two or three of the actors in this multi-stakeholder approach is not honest about it and is not implementing it. And so you are right, Nigeria is backsliding. There's no question about it. I shouldn't say it because Transparency International normally doesn't pass judgment on other countries, that we leave to our national chapters. But the national chapter in Nigeria agrees that they are backsliding. But generally it works. I mean, I can tell you personally that it works. I was the chair of the board of the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, and it was fantastic that Tony Blair supported it, George Soros supported it, and of course the civil society coalition of Publish What You Pay with about 500 NGOs all over the world, they supported it. And they will tell you it works. But of course you are right, in Nigeria right now, it doesn't work properly. I believe that multi-stakeholder approach are the great hope for us if you want to go into very difficult situations of bad governance, like for instance fisheries, you know, where the big fishing fleets of China, for instance, empty the waters of the coastal countries in Africa and so on. But also in other areas, if you want to develop authority in a society, you have to develop the consensus in society between these three parties, between the three main stakeholders. And I can tell you EITI works. I can tell you that FITI, the Fisheries Transparency Initiative, works. I hope that my local electricity access program for African villages will work in order to produce good governance in the villages so that people dare to invest in decentralized electricity. My experience the last 30 years tells me multi-stakeholder processes work very well.
Thank you, Peter. So we only have time for 2 more questions. So if our participant in the center and then our other participant over there could give your last 2 questions, and then the panel can respond.
Thank you so much. My name is Ke. I'm the Executive Director for Transparency International in Madagascar, but at the same time, the volunteer coordinator for Publish What You Pay in Madagascar. So this is a living proof that we can have coalitions which work. So I like very much the idea of a multi-stakeholder approach. But I would just like to appeal us not to forget the population, the citizens, because Peter, you said government, civil society, and the private sector. And then it seems to me there is a missing piece, because it's not all the population or citizens who are embedded in the civil society as formally organized as it is. There are also the grassroots communities and, you know, even individuals who are hoping and willing for good, who have also to strive and struggle for, you know, combating corruption on an everyday basis. So we have to find ways to include them into the fight. And that's my question, how to? And my second question, how also to engage government to really go beyond commitments and, you know, those very beautiful speeches that they make at international conferences. How do we tie them with their words and make them deliver? Because that's what may make the stakeholders, multi-stakeholders approach fail. It's also governments, because there is a huge resistance from their side. They say in Madagascar, for instance, that anti-corruption is a priority, but they are not acting so. So how to engage them concretely? And just a last word on transition minerals. We signed the Publish What You Pay's declaration statement for COP26 as 27, and it is something crucial. I think it's high time for us within the movement as well to really get engaged on that fight for a real and just energy transition. Thanks a lot.
Our other question as well, and then I'll open it up to the panel.
Okay, my name is James Oai. I'm chairman of the International Economic Justice League. And first I want to thank Peter, the panelists, and actually everybody in this room for your fight against corruption. So thank you very much. I joined this session because of its promotion of partnerships in this fight. And I think we all agree that we need the general population to get engaged in this solution. Well, we do that at International Economic Justice League. And we do that targeting the 18 to 30-year-olds. But we need help. Okay? So our program, in a way that it does that, is it provides economic and social benefits to all of its participants. It provides true economic benefits to the businesses who participate in the programs, and it gives employers access to ethically aware job candidates. Okay. The program has been reviewed and accepted by the U.S. Department of Anti-Corruption. Shandana, who's no longer there. She sent us down to the Northern Triangle to meet with the presidents, universities, and business leaders in those 3 countries, where we had overwhelming acceptance. So the point is that we're accepted, but my problem is I'm not part of this community. I'm an entrepreneur. I don't have access to you good people and the people such as Peter and fine people and the panelists who can make a difference and who can help us. My background, I own companies that do targeted drug therapy using peptide conjugates. AI, we do process control and optimization of industrial plants using AI and ML. I'm an outsider. How can we get partnerships so that we can give everybody in this room access to the general population?
Great, I'll open up both. Peter, you'd like to begin?
Well, thank you very much. I'm sorry, did they ask you to speak? I'm delighted about these interventions because I think it's a misunderstanding if you think it's civil society participating in these multi-stakeholder arrangements, excluding the citizens. I mean, we assume that civil society goes beyond organized civil society. So for instance, the newest project which I have right now is to create better governance in villages in Africa in order to entice investors on decentralized electrification. And there we have 3 villages right now in Senegal who are participating in this. And they have multi-stakeholder groups in the village. And yes, the government is there. There is very often some observers or some chief or so who has official power. The private sector is there. People like you who want to do and who want to invest and want to make money as private investors and so on. They are there, both in the form of foreign investors, but also local investors, but also people who want to set up a sawmill or want to set up a hospital where they need electricity and things of this nature. And, of course, civil society is there, and that civil society includes the villagers. So this is quite clear. I mean, we can talk about this more in detail. And, of course, EITI has perhaps to learn to include more citizens, more people on the street. We believe very strongly in this statement. I guess it's one of your sustainable development goals, is go local, work local. I mean, this is why the whole TI organization is built on local national chapters, 120 national chapters all over the world, because they locally look at the things which are wrong or which can be changed. And that goes all the way down to the communities. In the very beginning, we talked about the islands of integrity, because we thought we cannot change the whole world and make it honest to zero just overnight. But if we can go into individual villages and individual municipalities where people know each other, we can make progress. So this is exactly the spirit which I hear there and which I also hear from there, because we want to give business access. I mean, business is not the villain. The business are the victims of corruption as well, but they are also the villains. And the people are villains and victims, and the government are villains and victims. And to get them together and to develop a modicum of consensus, or whether it's in fisheries, whether it's in oil and gas, whether it's in garment industries, and develop joint reports regularly about the weaknesses of the governance, about the obstacles to investment, but also about the possibilities of reform and the success in achieving reforms. Regular in reports like EITI does every year in a compliant country. Then this helps to build a consensus which will eventually lead to change. And then the authorities, which hopefully have democratic legitimacy, they can make decisions knowing that there is a consensus in society to go this way. And of course, transparency is the most important thing over everything. So I congratulate all of you because you look so transparent.
Thank you. Klaus, you had
very, very shortly, but this was 2 really super impactful questions. So on the population, you said a lot already. I don't understand where there's a single MBA program in the business school where there's not in every MBA studies an ethics part in there. I mean, let's start on the basics. I mean, why is this not in all the curriculums? This can be changed and has to be changed, absolutely. And on the governments, maybe just one call out. What I really admire at your OECD is this idea of monitoring of the parties to the convention. If you sign up to the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention, you will be independently monitored as a government. They look at your budget, at your track record on investigations, collective actions, and this is, I think, where we can hold governments also accountable by international collaboration.
Sunita, we'll go down the line.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to make 2 quick points on EITI and on citizen engagement. First on EITI, just to note that the standard is currently going through a revision process, and the extent to which the standard is able to evolve, particularly with regard to the energy transition, with regard to anti-corruption, and with regard to gender, will frankly make or break the standard in this moment and will impact its credibility going forward. So I think we're really at a moment of truth for the standard, and there's a tremendous opportunity here if we can put corruption at the center of the standard. Secondly, to the point about citizen engagement and linking back to the point of this panel, The pathway to a fair and sustainable future has to be determined by citizens in countries around the world. So yes, civil society can amplify the voices of those citizens, but it is national dialogue that needs to take place, again, with multiple stakeholders, but with citizen vision, citizen priority at the center. And that is what truly will make it a fair and sustainable future. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. As I said before, that next year, 2023, will be the stock-taking year in terms of the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. And in the development of the SDGs, citizens, everyone, were consulted. And I believe that when the stock-taking is being done, I mean, there'll be a number of meetings before then, before it culminates into the SDG Summit in New York in September next year. There will be opportunities for citizens to actually raise their voices, given the fact that the SDG 16.5 and will be also, this will also be looked at. So it's important for you to please raise up your voices. The UN is there to hear you in terms of stock taking. How far have you gone? What have we done? What should we do? What should we do much more to ensure that we stem the tide against corruption? Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. So we are over time, but I want to thank all of our panelists who will be here. And if anyone else had questions, please come find everyone as we continue with the conference. And thank you all for attending this session. We'll hand it back to you, Anna.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you to our panelists for a really insightful discussion, and thank you to you, the audience, for your questions. I'd also like to say a special thank you to Peter Eigen for having us all, as you say, at the 25th birthday party of the IACC under Transparency International. So thank you. Can we have another round of applause? While this concludes the plenary sessions for today, we still have a number of workshops and, of course, the Films for Transparency Festival, much like the documentary that you saw at the start. And just some housekeeping, we have some refreshments and food in the restaurant area from 6 p.m. this evening. Thank you, and see you all back here tomorrow.
Thank you.